Naveen, thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me. I have to say that when on FB, I saw the news of the Ottaway Award. I was so excited, and what really surprised me, but in a very happy way, was like I felt personally proud. And I've been thinking about that because I spent, I think, 2 years on it, like part time with you guys at Seagal, right? And the time between that award and then meeting you, and I've just been thinking about this interview and sitting here, I'm recognizing a lot of the books that were there when I first joined you guys.
Sure.
Some of these were
Particularly the Mahashwata.
yeah. Because I think you were in the process of doing that whole, a whole series at that time. And I'm really sitting here right now in your office, and I'm thinking, wow, you don't realize how much environment makes you, and gives you look back and realize how much the environment you create gives you. And I'd actually like to talk to you a little bit about that to start off with. When I joined Seagal, I was working with STQ for Seagal Theatre Quarterly, but it wasn't just about going and seeing theatre events or theatre places and writing about it. You were also sending us to conferences to participate. You were sending us to festivals to participate. You were creating, I remember the workshop between Janusz Shriti and Swayam, where you guys actually set up the workshop. I think it was a Swayam need, if I'm correct, or something Swayam would have liked
Possibly
to do.
it's too far back, yeah.
But you set up the workshop, we ran it, you had sent me there to do part of the running, and then we covered it. So there was that way in which...
I think you participated in the workshop.
Yeah. But at the same time, so I'm giving a little bit of the slide because it's my memories, right? At the same time, I remember you had also done an installation of Chitravanus, I think, in a big warehouse godown kind of place, I think somewhere in Loudon Street, where, and I remember walking across all these really large, like, snake-like things.
That's right. This was, that building with all those Alan Solly shops.
Yeah.
He'd done this strange sort of satin snakes full of whole place. Yes.
And
near the petrol pump.
Yeah.
That's Rawdon Street, Low Rawdon Street.
And being part of Seagal meant that we went and walked through that, and that was perhaps my first experience of walking through an installation like that. And then you also were at that time working with Chapal Bhadri, and you had set up a performance of his I think somewhere in North Calcutta, in a lane.
No, he'd set up the performance. I was taking photographs.
Okay. So we went there as well.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that working with you guys wasn't really just about
attending office
and writing reviews and stuff like that. It was this, like, I mean, I know I'm not going to get into it here, but it's made so much of my attitude. And I wanted to just pause there and say, where did those decisions come from? What was it that was, you laughed the other day and said, I want to do everything, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that everything that you were doing, and what was making all of that happen for you, if you can reflect on it.
Sure. I was just enjoying all this. I thought this would be just you talking and me nodding at appropriate moments. Where do these decisions come from? It's really who walks in through the door, right? So you have one kind of person working in the arts and culture and theatre and film who may feel inhibited, inhibited rather, not inhabited, because sometimes walking into spaces of a certain kind, having come to that space knowing of a certain kind of reputation, because we've always had a kind of larger than life image of when I was doing theatre in the 70s, the way we did it, which was a kind of intuitive aesthetics. It came from all kinds of things, we can talk about that. But that sort of person feels awkward. Once they cross the threshold, they realize that it's all very hospitable. At least I'd like to believe that, and there are enough examples that later become other people's projects. So there was that. Chitravanu was one such project, except that he didn't walk in through the threshold. I did. Anjum had taken me to him way back, it's 84, and I saw, and this was my first real encounter with a live artist and paintings and so on and so forth, and I came away silently, and Anjum was disappointed and said, but what happened? I said, when do we do the show? So, I said, but I'm in the presence of something that moves me. And this, when do we do the show, the book, or whatever, is something that's probably grown out of the fact that I started life as what we used to call freelancer, right? And well before the days of event management became popular and the label, we used to call them impresarios, where the only thing you were certain of was that you would make a living within the arts, and which was frowned upon in those days because you were expected to do other things too.
Still frowned
Do
upon.
certain. So it was like, there were no inhibitions about lack of knowledge, lack of skill. Am I trained? Because within the Indian sort of arts cultural context, nobody trains in that sense. Yes, you had a drama school. You still have a drama school. Given all the so-called smaller things that happen in Bombay and so on and so forth. You have one film institute, so on and so forth. So it's not that easy for people to train except on the job. Then I had to plunge into what was a hobby, which was theatre design, lighting design, and so on and so forth. So I was very receptive to other people making a living.
Okay.
So when somebody had an idea and you saw possibilities, it didn't matter whose idea it was, in the same way where I've always held forth within my circle of affection about the fact that one need not be possessive about the idea, because the idea, it's how you execute it. So you can take my idea and make what you will of it, right?
Yeah.
Which, in any case, goes back to the conversation, just to digress a little, where you and other people are curious about legacies, and I still feel that legacies are also evolving. They are experience, their knowledge, their precedents, but you make your own way. So one doesn't, I certainly don't bother about that. I'm not arrogant in my not bothering, but I'm going to be dodo land, so it doesn't really matter at that level. Similarly, within the arts, when you encounter other people with ideas, you protect, nurture, because it comes naturally. And if you want to look at it some psychological way, could be because when I was growing up and seeking sponsorship and funding and resources in a certain way, I constantly wished I had somebody who could, so when you were in position to be able to pull that off for people, you did that. So in that sense, I think I've always intuitively seen this business of supporting other people, and that has kind of led to the book project too, right? It's the same kind of midwifery.
Right.
You're happiest in being the conduit.
Yeah.
If you present an artist for the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and their reputation grows, as does yours.
Right.
You can't then take credit for the fact that, so much percentage of his success or her success is due to me. No. You, in a certain time, become the circumstance, the conduit, the reason for showcasing, reflecting somebody else's thing through your way of presenting it. I've often, for example, I remember once when Shubhada, dear Shubha Prasad now, he was, at that time I'd just shown K.G. Subramanian and I was showing Chitravanu frequently, and Shubhada said, it'd be lovely to work together. And I said, it'd be lovely to work together, but I genuinely feel that you're your best actor, manager. You present things, you find spaces, you find sponsorship, you do a lovely catalogue. So I tend to do it with perhaps, and he understood it. And, we've remained friends.
Right.
And it wasn't as if I was rejecting something like that. So we countless examples of, it's not like necessarily a very thought out position.
Sure.
But like everything else, it happens. The encounter is the thing.
Right. And also, just connecting to what you said earlier, the fact that in this country, you don't have much training for the arts. You have even less training to be a conduit. Like if you're a designer, a theatre designer, or a visual artist or anything, you learn on the job. The number of people who are then the people who facilitate the arts getting out to other people or sharing are even fewer, I think, and there are even less places to,
Possibly, yeah.
you know, and that's sort of the place that you've jumped in. Like I would, you're an unusual impresario in that sense, let me put it that way, because there was a certain kind of frontal presentation of a lot of impresarios, and here was somebody who was creating the space for, and that's why I was thinking of those ideas. But just jumping back, I've also always seen you as recognizing gaps very fast, you know, so and then filling those gaps is the sense I've always had of yours. And I remember one conversation we had when I was at Prithvi, where I was asking you, you know, why you did this, you know, why these books, etc. And you said because they weren't there and I want to read them, if my memory serves me correctly.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, you know, and now I'm looking at those early books that when I first entered, I remember Mahashala Devi, Mrinal Sen, you know, Mahesh Kunjwar, I think you had started talking about Shanta Gokhale's project. And then this list of books now you have from across the world. And I wonder if we can, what seems to be gaps? I mean, there are so many writers, right? But what is the gap that you most desire to fill? If we just talk of it at a slightly
First of all, I don't know if I recognize gaps. I may at best have a hunch.
Okay.
At that moment, fed by the desire to do something tempting. It's really that.
Right.
And it's only when you get into it and plunge into it do you begin to recognize that, oops, there is a lacuna of sorts.
Right.
Because then you get into the nitty-gritty of fact-finding.
Right.
Once you choose to. You know. So if you did, for example, 2005, you have perfectly reasonable publishing setup, nice aesthetics, you're respected, you're doing a certain Indian and some Russian seminar and theatre and the arts and some theoretical stuff, and then you recognize that your location is actually thrust upon you. Because I still bristle when somebody says Indian publisher, German publisher. You know, you're a publisher.
Right.
So the location is thrust upon you barely means that you've traditionally our relationship with the English-speaking West has been that we buy the rights in publishing terms to publish within our boundaries. And so something at that point must have triggered it off, and I think the trigger could have been, and I've often said this, all the multinationals settling down in India because we're great readers. So we thought we'd reverse the trend. It wasn't because I recognized a gap. I recognized the need to tackle something which was a lacuna, which is this constricted boundary thing at one end, another end, we're all supposed to be across cultures, across boundaries, globalized, all that sort of stuff. So one experimented by setting up Seagull Books London Limited, and you know, the rest is all this history, last 16 years, over 500 books. But the idea is that and when you're exploring that, then you understand where the gaps are. At that moment, there was much less translated literature happening, before which, when we were growing up, there was a lot of translated literature. And then it became a kind of numbers game where people, you know, big companies couldn't sustain themselves by doing serious literary translation. So there were all these reasons. But that happens after, when you're actually doing it. And perhaps the doing is the focus of, or the core of everything.
Okay.
Right? And doing in all its aspects. Doing as in getting excited about idea and therefore turning it into logistics, executable, logistics, and so on and so forth. That's a certain kind of doing. Resisting the time or things that look like obstacles is also doing in a certain way. Now, especially politically, it's become important that all of us do, whether it's to stand up and do it or to, do it in clandestine ways, whatever. So, I think, what has to be understood is that it's not just romantic mishmash when I say that there is, all plans are retrospective. That's the only way I can explain it, because even in this conversation, it's like I'm exploring all of these thoughts for the first time, and of course there's repetition, because Sometimes people have asked you things like that, but I don't know what's coming next. And so therefore, I'm open to the challenge. And that's part of the excitement. You're also here because of your literary life, your excitement, your passions are fed. I mean, you love being in relationships with other people, authors, translators, other publishers, booksellers. So it's a kind of, and this is what happened in theatre.
Right.
Right? So there are lots of theatre connections if you can explore them, sure. I mean, you can, the aesthetic itself, you know, I mean, or just the fact that this 5-room bookstore is like a living gallery of one person's creativity.
Yeah.
You know, Shivandri as a designer, and yet it looks, I'm willing to bet every time you bring in a bunch of young people or older ones, they will think many minds are at work here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's something to be said for a certain intuitive way of doing it. We were always told, read a cover aesthetic for Great Britain and you read a cover aesthetic for the US. Her covers go, Seagal's design aesthetics go across cultures.
Yeah. Yeah. No, two things I want to actually pick up on, and one is, again, my earliest memories when I first started working with Seagal. I remember so clearly one day we were working and Ketuki Datto came into the office and had lunch with us, and then we didn't go back to work. Maybe you went back to work, but the rest of us didn't.
Circus Avenue or something.
Circus Avenue, yeah. And she's sitting and regaling us with stories, and of course we are not moving. And then she laughed at the end of it, and she goes, I can still hold an audience, you know. And then I remember Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak being in the office, sprawled out on the floor and doing something.
Yeah, with her clothes drying. She just come from the villages and stuff.
Right. And, you know, and I know that for me also, no matter where you've been.
You do realize that we paid vast sums of money to Gayatri Di and Ketuki Datto so that I would eventually have a memoir which had stories like this.
I'm happy to give my stories. I'm sure you paid vast sums.
Ketuki Di is not there, but Gayatri Di, poor thing, don't play this for her. Yeah.
Anyway, so, now you made me go off track. No. But I'm just saying that these are part of my memories. But I also know, Naveen, every time I come back to Calcutta, that Seagal is a home for me. I know that I can call and I can say, come in, and you will say, we have to work, but I can sit, or I can say, I want to come and work, and I can be here and it's okay. And I know that, and I feel from the write-ups that have come after your award and stuff like that, that there's a relationship that you also have with your global authors.
Of course, yes. With everything.
And, yeah,
space.
So my question to you is, if you were to, and I know it's intuitive, it was what feels right for you, but I'm asking you to put into words as much as you can, what you're feeling, like what your approach to these relationships is, what drives you in these relationships, how do you build this, because actually you're not working with authors. My sense is you've built a community of people, Seagull Books and Naveen, you know, because I sense an expanding community, and the kind of love and trust that Seagal gets is quite extraordinary. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
It's really, it's good old-fashioned love and affection for people. I mean, it's, you get on with people, so I mean, I don't see any great mystery or whatever.
But I guess
relationship building is, okay, so if you have to break it down, then how do relationships happen with authors, right? And how does it happen when you have 70% of your list is on translation? You often get to meet the authors well after their first, second, third, fourth books are out. Sometimes for years you don't meet them, because after all you're dealing with Kunal, the French publisher, Kunal, the German publisher, and you're dealing with Samira, the translator, sitting elsewhere. Sometimes you don't meet translators.
Right.
Not everybody comes to Frankfurt, right? Yeah. You travel to them. So you travel sometimes out of great need, because you want to see these people. Need when these are authors that you grew up reading and now you have the honor to publish. Enzensberger, Alexander Kluger, Bonhoeffer, Michael Kruger, all these names. And then when you meet people, you've already related to them through their work. In quite the same way, the only way I want to be remembered is through my work.
Right.
You know, there have been people, when the Goethe medal was given, Elizabeth Ruge, who was doing the laudatory speech, all my German friends were very nervous that she hasn't, but how did she know about you? There was just one exchange where she wanted some catalogs and we sent it. And then I met her at the award 10 minutes before I was supposed to speak, and you know, she comes to me, gives me a hug and whispers, "How is Shanandini?" So strange. And I said, "Wow, from catalogs?" And then she does a speech based on my name. She talks, you read the speech, it's online.
I will.
And you get this, somebody approaches you through your catalogs, your work, recognizes the wealth of effort and labor and skill and genius that goes
And
into
love.
it from other people.
Yeah.
You are still the conduit.
Yeah.
So in other words, there are people backstage. You are also backstage. So it's a kind of level of whatever. And so relationships is also about, and I can come to the tools of that if you want, but the relationships is also, it's first and foremost my need, right? If you and I grew up together, or the fact that Jayant and Gulam, or Siddharth Vasu, the few friends that and then, they migrated to Delhi and Bombay and made their fortunes. I appeared not to be making my fortune in those terms, right? But it was my need to stay in touch constantly. Or if I was flying out of the country, I'd make sure I'd fly out of Delhi or Bombay so I could spend a few hours with them. So therefore, relationships have to be without quid pro quo.
Yeah.
That if she hasn't called, you have the need to call, right? Without being a persistent stalker. But you know what I mean? So similarly, I would write letters to these people. There's a wonderful catalogue. And what was interesting was that this energy somehow was conveyed to fairly serious French and German, Italian publishers who opened up about their authors. You could write to them directly, which normally doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, sometimes I would write to the head of Penguin India, for example, or XYZ, and say, I need to talk to this author on behalf of somebody who wants to invite them, but no, they're not allowed to, they will check.
Right.
Whereas here, there was great hospitality. So I was recognizing that there was a very hospitable community of publishers. But the fact, like other independents, like Barbara Apple of New Directions, gave us and wrote this wonderful letter to Laszlo Krasznahorka, I went out to with the book, who was her author, that you can do your non-fiction with Naveen because he's really wonderful. So there's a kind of,
like almost a community of indie publishers,
which doesn't, I mean, it's not like a sworn thing,
of course.
There are instances of respect, and of course it's not meant to be foolhardy, but
right.
And then there are personal relationships. My preferred form of relationship is letter writing, for example, and I mean, other people tell me this, but I've also now begun to see what they mean, which is that there is no difference between the professional and the personal letter. So, if I would write to a rights manager somewhere, or an author somewhere, I mean, there's no formality, but it's not American TV. It's not that kind of a thing. There is a understanding and a reaching out, and even something simple like when you're transacting the idea of buying a book from a German publisher, and the book is in some sort of demand, the author is relatively interesting and supposedly known. You lay your cards on the table and you say, I will make you a wonderful book. That's all I can do. And you also paint parallelly a black picture which shows what you can deliver, either by way of distribution, that you can do this much, maybe not that much, or you can give this much as an advance. It's very important, but you don't do it like a game. You make it clear from day one, you desperately want to do this book, but on these terms.
Right.
And if not, then you will be deeply upset, but you will carry on. Right? So, there's no formula. In the same way, we can't genuinely teach anybody design, aesthetics. You can teach the nitty-gritty as we do in the publishing school. And where you can kindle that, but eventually, how you wear your shirt on a t-shirt, what sort of shoes, socks is your aesthetic. It's how you put it together. And one can guide the process a bit. But or any form of. I mean, you can hint and suggest these things, but you can't really say if you do this, 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 this.
Right.
Right.
Because it's not about process
Yeah.
in that sense.
Also, the first time we met, Zulkan, Petra Hart, and it was like, she was there and her colleague was in the room who works with her, Uli, and used to. And I'm so sorry, the books have just fallen.
The books are mesmerized listening to you, so they've
Yeah.
fallen. Okay.
And we were having this conversation, and it turned out within 2 minutes that Shani and I discovered that they had never been to India.
Oh.
We were discussing things. Now, I'm not a vast philanthropy I just instinctively did something to strangers, first meeting, where I didn't single out the boss figure as the rights manager. I treated them both as the two people who were in the same room. Therefore, I said, the best way to have this conversation is for you to come. I will send you tickets. Come to Calcutta. I will introduce you to Bengali publishers and German other publishers and Goethe. Let's just do it. I didn't think where it was coming from or what. They, good people that they are, took it at face value. And their part of the conversation was later relayed to us when we became family. That he's serious. So they came.
Wow.
And the rest, historically, you can say this was great strategy, but I couldn't have predicted that this relationship would become strong, and we've done over 100 books together. At the same time, they're very comfortable with saying no. Even after I've done 2-3 books of one author and they get better big mass markets, because after all, both of us are committed to the authors.
Right.
So you get heartbroken.
And
you
to
realize
readership.
it.
Yeah.
So to be able to say no,
Yeah.
and to be able to say it quickly is also very important. In the same way you relate to, I have so many wonderful well-wishers in the people I've rejected manuscripts that do it within 30 seconds if I have to.
Okay.
Because every second raises the level of expectation and hope,
Right.
which is not fair.
Right.
So you write and you explain, but you don't end it there.
Right.
You try and create a blueprint of where they could go,
Right.
what they could do,
Right.
why you're not able to do this.
Right.
So this is all very important. And if it doesn't work for you, it's like going backstage to each other's plays, right?
Yeah.
And you can be kind of person who can do how wonderful you are, Samira, and make that kind of conversation. Or you can say, we need to talk about this. I enjoyed lots of it, but I also have issues with a lot of things. Can I write to you, or would you want me to come and talk to you guys? Sometimes it works.
Yeah.
And of course you will bristle at criticism.
Yeah.
That's normal. But because you relate, you're in a relationship, the bristle is accepted and reciprocated till it, whatever. So yeah, I think your entire personality comes into relationship. And then there's no holds barred. You can't hold back. You can't count it in money terms. You have to be there.
Yeah.
You can screw up. But you can also make up when you screw up.
Yeah.
That's also important.
Yeah. You picked up on the Seagull School of Publishing, and it's something I've been thinking about because in so many, it's what you said, right? You can teach a craft, you can teach a process, but finally what comes out is the heart of it. And I've always been fascinated by how do you share your heart, how do you share your values, or not in a overt kind of way, but how, like my guess would be that if you're training publishers and editors and designers, what you're also trying to train is people with this attitude towards authors and writers and stuff. And I'm keen to hear how you build that into the way Seagull.
Exactly the same way you just said it, which is that you first of all, you don't sugarcoat anything, and neither do you reject anything. So you do not set yourself up against as some kind of see, people treat independent as some angsty, making two ends meet. Everyone's making two ends meet, even the HarperCollins. I'm sure it's not easy. And so you're getting a bunch of people. It's like a bit like arguing a case in court. You present both sides of the argument, And of course you do it passionately, and that's where yours, life's work comes into play, your experience. And then it's up to them to choose how they negotiate, what balances they find. After all, they're going to go into the real world of publishing, which may not be quite like, the school is a protected space in that sense.
Course,
You come, you're surrounded by books, you're surrounded by design and art, and all these people with stories and all of that kind of stuff. But you invite everybody, whether it's a multinational from New York or Delhi or wherever, to independents, to language publishers. You want them to be publishers, editors, designers. You don't want them to be Indian publishers, editors, designers, or Japanese publishers.
Right.
Also, the values are the same. It's Frankfurt in a nutshell. So many cultures.
Right.
So for us, it's also because they are hearing. First of all, there are no lessons of the kind you can take notes after. If you miss a class, you missed a class. You have to catch up through the storytelling of your colleagues. There's no lecture that you hand out. It's not the standard course where you read a paper, you give a little bit. So it's the energy in the room, genuinely, which means some people interested in poetry and have questions, some in graphic novels have questions. And you're, as organizers, as people addressing all that and already thinking ahead, I can get Samira because she will be good at addressing these. So your salad bar changes.
Right.
Depending on the mix that's offered to you. You spend a lot of time on this whole business of the fact that the process of publishing, which means as if you really editors or designers, but you must know all aspects of it.
Right.
How do you print paper? What happens to that book that you edited and tossed and then comes back to you one day in great excitement as a finished book, but that cycle you don't know about. It's nice to know.
Yeah.
You won't necessarily practice it for years or ever. You may get rusty with it, but the knowledge, you will be able to hold a conversation about design or rights or editing while editing a book, right? And it helps the whole thing. So the teaching process, which was new to us, is essentially done by Shanazini and Bishan and a host of other people that come in and do master classes. I do certain things, contracts, rights, beyond the contract, which is a whole interesting area of philosophical discussion of what goes into a piece of paper between two people, what's omitted, like it is in photography.
Right.
And it's the omission where the ethics of how life changes, what other points come up because of that relationship and the circumstances. Therefore, how do you address that, or do you hide behind that piece of paper?
Right.
So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that happens. I think the students feel part of the process of discovery beyond the nitty-gritty. There's lots of nitty-gritty.
Correct, of course. Yeah.
Shravi spends days on bibliographies, for example, or Bishan will take grammar classes, and all of that stuff that happens. But there's also what you were getting at, which is the attitude. How do you, because we try and create an atmosphere where a certain fair play and ethics and yes, we definitely are biased towards a certain romance. And there will always be students and other realities where you will want to know about how do you, they want Excel sheets of how target audiences can be found, research, etc., which is possible to do. So you don't dismiss it. But you also suggest that it's actually very difficult to find. You have to find them within you first. And if a bunch of you doing this will respond to something, then there must be other people out there.
Yeah.
Whether they're 200 or 2,000 or 20,000, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for each book to become a profit center. But the real world expects each book to be a profit center, which then reflects on the kind of bookstores you have now, or the kind of distributors you have.
Yeah.
So lots of issues which are personal in that way, and it's how you deal with them. So we're also discovering ourselves as to, you're faced with maybe 25, 30 people, and sometimes the different levels of understanding, interest, all the rest of it. So when Shravani and Bishan teach, I've seen how they, that tendency that we've all faced in our school, college days, where somebody's put down, there are little jokes, none of that. They pull everybody up.
Lovely.
Sometimes you've had students where she's addressed them in Bengali, in English, because they came from a background where Bengali made sense, so you repeated everything, but it happens intuitively. There is a certain knowledge that each day when you come to the space to work, you have certain things you need to do, right? Some more than others. But there is also parallel unpredictability of what's going to come at you on that day, good, bad, and different. So nothing is written in stone, right? Of course, there are shipments to be made, printers, binders. You also don't create stress and pressure for them. This I learned way back in the 80s in my first printer, PK Ghosh of East End, when inadvertently one ended up creating pressure around a book fair deadline. And I instinctively said no, because it was so important, the well-being of that person. And I said, it doesn't matter. It's not ready. It's not ready. It's not the end of the world. It's my book. Eventual readership, we'll get to that. Book fair is just an occasion. So that is also important, that you, because people do screw up, we're all fallible. Screwing all the time. So everyone has the right to do that. Sometimes it takes years to convince Samira that she can make a mistake about things, money, material, bad proofing, whatever, not as a virtue, but that if it happens, it's not, it's the buck stops with me. In that sense, you kind of do that, you handle it, because it's always human beings you're working with. So so relationships across everything. You can pick up any object here and that has a story, whether it's a painting or a little knick-knack or a book cover, even these 4 covers for Romila's book coming. So but the storytelling is when you think about it.
Yeah.
Mostly when you're doing, you're just doing.
And you're being guided by your...
And there must be many people who work like that.
So
it's not that, it's not that, you see, there's also kind of common myth that we are floating in this stuff, and that we, because we have a magic formula, how else could you sell books of this nature, all that kind of stuff? Or, some kind of eccentric philanthropy at work in Mr. Naveen Kishore. No, there is a mental math, only it's quicker sometimes than a lot of people. And the mental math is not about what you're going to get out of it, but how much can you afford to not get.
Right.
In the same way, the pandemic, my broken record, stock record, whatever you want to call it, is that this is a particular time that has taught us to share. So it doesn't matter what you have, it's old-fashioned, it's across cultures, across religions, all of that, but nobody practices it enough. You do it in individual cases, right? But to, just genuinely go, and you have to practice it sometimes, because it doesn't necessarily come. It's an acquired art, sharing. And that's important, because when you take that extra step of sharing resources that quite clearly look obviously scarce to the other person too, that is how publishing, this is what the whole thing is about now in particular. It's very, very important that we, treat this period of introspection thrust upon us, or this anxiety thrust upon us, or this kind of common sense of losing everything, including revenues, by figuring out ways of, being a community. That's important.
Being a larger publishing community. Yeah. So, I'm going to pick up on your publishing. You had mentioned earlier that what has the pandemic done to the publishing school?
It's gone online. Beautifully so. Last year we did our first online course, and it has its plus points in the sense that lots of people who couldn't afford to join do, because now you can come from Ethiopia or Kenya, Pakistan. Pakistan traditionally has been wanting to come. You don't get visas, and so this year we expect visa. Cambodia, and within the Indian countries, a lot of young people sometimes miss out, or we've had a lot of young people who have young kids, not single mothers so much as new mothers, and they join because then you can, so it's that part of it. The teaching too, we've adapted. A typical busload of people going to a printing press to spend a day is done in a half-an-hour film. So you show the process like a home movie.
Right.
It's they have not sort of. It's convenient, certainly, especially if you don't have funding support for it any longer. And then you tend to, you reach out to more people. And the teaching process we discovered was easier than we thought.
Yeah.
It wasn't linear to blank screens.
Right.
There were blank screens too. It was very interactive. Lots of questions. You actually felt as engaged as you do without the, the sort of flesh and sweat feel of the space. And that's a different energy when you're in the same room. You can see them all totally. And all that. A different relationship at that level. This is a relationship through a kind of, but it's not a one-way relationship where most Zooming trainings are.
No, in fact, I think the big difference that I've often experienced with the Zoom and the live is that what you miss is that interaction between the cigarette break or the tea break. That little extra that brings, that doesn't happen on the Zoom because the time is. But I've been surprised also at how interactive Zoom can actually be, even if you're getting talks or anything like that. So the other question that I wanted to ask you is, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Quilombola, which, have I understood correctly, you are now going to publish in French?
No.
Okay.
We're not going to publish in French. It's essentially an imprint of Seagal, which is a series of books that are curated by our Cameroonian French author, Leonara Miano. And again, this is part of this whole business of vocation and how a certain political way of doing publishing, where through a series of accidents, let us say, that she came in as a student, first as an author, then a student at the school.
Oh, okay.
And because she wanted to do things in Africa, all that. So something that would normally have originated with a French publisher, originated with us, which meant that you were selling, and these books are written in French mostly, some are now being written and commissioned in English. You're selling the right to the French to publish in French, as against you buying the English language right.
Okay.
You are translating in English.
Okay.
The Germans are buying from you to translate from the French. The Italians will buy from you to translate from the French. The original writing is in French.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Now this turns the status quo of publishing around totally.
Right.
And brings attendant difficulties, because it's not easy for French publishers to get used to the idea of buying rights to publish in their own language from an Indian publisher, supposedly, who is not necessarily an Indian publisher. I could be based anywhere, but my location, where I work, my birth, all of that sort of stuff. So that's interesting. So it takes a little longer to sell those rights. Whereas the books have begun to come out, and so it's wonderful. And this is non-fiction. It's a certain kind of Francophone Africa writing, political as well. The first two books, Shades of Black and Blind Spot, are out.
Okay.
Shades of Black, for example, exactly what the name says. You and I know the different shades of class and caste and all that here, but I didn't know, for example, I was naive enough not to know, because my own lack of knowledge, that there are hierarchies within the American academia. Afro-American has a certain place, and Cameroonian, or an Ethiopian, part French, part, all of that. So there are different shades of black. Or you have Blind Spot, or you have an actor who's has a white French mother and Ethiopian father. And as a director, what do you cast her as? The white, the black? So there are those things that she has to negotiate, and all the attendant things that come at her. So it all comes back to being publishers.
Right.
You can give labels, international, sitting here, all that. That's not it. It's again, it's like sustainability. The content has to be good. then you will sustain yourselves and the money will follow and so on and so forth. But if your heart's not in what you're publishing,
Right.
it's still publishing, but it's a different kind of publishing.
Right. Okay.
And this particular award is what it celebrates
yeah,
in a sense,
yeah.
right?
So, in fact, since you brought the award up, you're what, the first person from the Global South and the first non-white person to be getting this award?
Yeah, it's a new award. It says, I think there have been about 7 recipients, and probably, yes, I think. Yes, that's right. Yes. You can look it up.
And, I mean, if I just ask you to think into the future, given that your publishing school now actually has a reach, like you've just mentioned, a whole bunch of countries, and you've also mentioned in speaking earlier how part of what you've done is refuse the frame and then try to change it in some sense. And it's come up a number of times. That seems to be one of the impulses. Do you see Seagull having a larger, is there any future idea of a larger connection with peoples of Ethiopia, Kenya, Cambodia, etc.
That's growing. I mean, that's happening all the time. It doesn't have to become a large organizational infrastructure. It's just content. So it's, a lot of these lists, most of these lists are very organic. So again, who comes your way and says, I want to do this.
Sorry, my question is not so much about the books being published as much as this kind of independent publisher being possible in
totally, because we are completely accessible and we reach out constantly whenever any of these nations, wherever I'm addressing a bunch of people for 2 hours in a sort of mentorship program with Cambodian potential publishers and cultural entrepreneurs or whatever on Saturday. So it's something you do all the time.
Okay.
Because every platform is important to spread this whole affirmation of the word is important. It's not like personal thing, which is also welcome. I mean, in the sense that the location of the award is important to get a certain thing noticed. Right? So in that sense, it's linked to, and also when it comes from within a certain peer group, which recognizes without you having to fill forms or apply for an award or whatever. So, I mean, we've constantly opened. You see, the thing about institutions of this nature, where it's not just books, there's the History for Peace, there's Seagull School of Publishing, all kinds of programs that people run independently, and it's, I think the only thing I have an antenna out for is that we must never become a dead institution that feels we know it all and we have arrived. Because the moment you've arrived, then you might as well be in Dodo land, because then you've done everything.
And you stop growing also.
So you've arrived. So now there's nothing else to do, which is, so I think travel journey, that old Bharat Sarkar, Devang Indrajit motif of the train tracks, you just, it doesn't matter which direction you head. Sometimes you take a few steps back, or it doesn't matter. But the important thing is that, you see, if your work becomes, you can't become larger than the work.
Right.
That's the problem. Right. A lot of us, even within our community, sometimes feel that we are greater than the work we do.
Yeah.
And that screws things up. However saintly it sounds, it's true.
No, but you see that with artists. When they get stuck is when they have become more important with the work. You see that with others. Feel this
often
way.
happens.
It's when the work is supreme.
And you can course correct if you listen.
Of course. Naveen, in India there is, like you're bringing so many voices out from so many places. In India also there are so many voices of the more, I hesitate to use the word marginalized, because they're marginalized for people like us. But there's some fantastic, say, Dalit writing happening and stuff. I know there's translations and stuff happening. Are any of these spaces also key focuses for Seagull, or
all the time? If it's again, as I said, there's often the circumstance of finding material and so on and so forth. Maybe we don't necessarily sort of. It doesn't become. It's like, for example, Bishar and Sandeep have been editing and put together this slowly growing Pride list, right? There's a book right there. So there's, but it is India, but it's also the rest of the world. That's
Right.
very important.
Right.
So if you're working, if the only thing that we feel is if somebody is already doing good work in certain areas, then if I get certain material, I will give it to them
Right.
first,
Of course.
as friends in the group. But, often you get tempted. To me, I'm approaching it as great writing. So wherever it comes from. And yes, your antennas are out for interesting material, whether it's certain kind of Dalit writing, or, what you said. I mean, people who need to have their voice in print, intangible between the covers. One more way of disseminating beyond whatever else or whatever other activism that they are capable of. That's always going to happen. We ourselves are, I mean, at one level, a certain kind of privilege comes with publishing in this hegemonic language of English worldwide, because you may be a German first-time debut author who sells 20 to 40,000 copies, but you want to sell those 600 in English.
Right.
Unfortunately, but that's the reality.
Because that's the global reach you get.
So
Yeah.
we are comfortable, we're comfortable with, things as they are, and what we see. You can't deliver on every front.
Right.
But when somebody points out to you that this needs attention, you respond to it as content first, and then everything else follows, the politics of it.
So one of the reasons I'm asking is also because you spoke about Shades of Black, right? And I've been reading, for some strange reason, I don't know why, but I've recently been reading books on race and books by Westerners, which actually opens up a lot of these histories and stuff. But the thing is, every time I read those books, I think about caste in India.
Sure.
And it just reflects, and I'm quite taken with how either it's my awareness now, or it is the publishing. I'm not aware enough to know whether there are just more books and more writing.
There are more books and more writing, and people
on race.
On everything. I mean, there
Because
are
there
platforms
seems to-
beyond the print.
Yeah, because there seems to be a wonderful articulation that is coming into the mainstream sphere, let me say, in a sense. That means you can walk into a bookshop and access it into a fairly decent bookshop. It doesn't have to be a highly knowledgeable bookshop, And that's why I've just been thinking of these things, which is why that question. We've brought up Shurandini and Bishan a lot in speaking. And I think when I ask you questions about legacy, I don't think I'm asking about Naveen Kishore. I think I'm asking about this Seagull as an ethos, right?
You have over 200 students carrying forward those things.
Right.
It's it's the values. It's in the same way you bring up your young, by example.
Right.
So,
And you've already set in the place. You were telling me the other day that both Shurandini and Bishan are part owners or shareholders. I don't know the correct word for these things of
of course,
Seagull Books.
ownership is
And they've been around with you for a long time now, right? Shurandini for 20-25 years has been part of Seagull.
25 years, but I think one has been around for 19, the other person has been around for about 13, but that's not the issue. The issue is a kind of, after a while, how much can you reward certain labor, certain creativity, how much can you pay colleagues, what kind of situations do you create for their securities. So all of those issues come into play for any number of small organizations like that. It's like, say, something like, why just Bishan and Shurandini? Someone like a Vega, for example, who first came into our lives as a bookstore person, and then later she comes back and makes the whole Peaceworks program its own, her own, because when we started it, I started it in certain political circumstances in the country, you did it, but my colleagues at that point, whether it was Tuki Zuchi, who was no longer there, or the others that worked here, there was a kind of hesitancy, because a certain kind of very intelligent being feels inhibited about what appears to be some kind of messaging, learning to live with difference, or Kabila harmony, or all of that kind of stuff. So I felt that. I never discussed it with the others, but there was kind of, with Megha, she just took it over. So it's like, and now it's become part of History for Peace, and they're working with teachers too. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff happening all the time through the pandemic. Colleagues have been weekly programs, all of that sort of switching to online. Now that independent space takes years to arrive at, and it's the personality of the person who colors it. So I often don't fully know the thing. So what I'm trying to say is that these continuities are essentially inherently what you're left with when that founder being is not there,
right,
in crude terms, and then that's when your values come into play. It's like saying that, it's like Vijay saying, I brought these kids up and look at what the fuck are going on, kind of stuff. But
Vijay is my dad.
But post Vijay's words or training or values which he didn't force down your throat are remembered, and in times of trouble you have solutions being offered to you in quite the way you find solutions in books or find in other elders which are not your elders directly,
right,
but through the experiences of the reading you do. So through dark times, people have always turned to books in a certain way to find answers if you want to, and not just the Bible. So I don't think these are the issues. The issues is you need to bring focus back into the fact that everybody involved does things that they want to do and have the freedom to be able to do it. And it's your small circle, your small orbit of affection that if you can make it feasible and make it as comfortable for them, that's fine. If you can't, that's how it carries on.
Okay, last question. You've talked about location a lot. Saying your location, there's a frame and then how you switch that around. But what does your location being Calcutta actually bring? Like, what is the word I'm searching for? What is being actually located in Calcutta help with? Like, what is this? In all that you've talked of about how Seagull is the way it is, what would you say is the positive of being actually located in Calcutta?
I suppose my confidence in the relationship I have with the city, which is not a complaining one, though I also complain because I have the right to. And despite seeing things, from a viewpoint, for what obviously every generation, they're growing up in a certain way. So the sort of late 70s into 80s, or through the 70s, early 70s. So you see a difference in the cities, both culturally. Its energy levels have dropped. It has become exhausted. All that kind of stuff, which is fine. But at its core, there's a lot that it contributes. And it does that because we've contributed in turn. It's a two-way process, right? We grew up doing theatre and music and dance, all kinds of stuff. So you're part of the cultural history or milieu or community of this place. This doesn't mean that you will be missed for even a second, perhaps, or maybe you would be if you stop to be. But you have influenced, you like it or not. You still run into people who will be amazed at, and we will be amazed, and we are constantly, at what they remember, some things that you have moved on from also. So it's a kind of two-way street. It's a very nurturing space, very hospitable space. In many ways, despite the politics of the land, I think it's still a very creative space for people who wish to make something of it, right? And there is truth of a lot of younger people having had to leave. They only come back when they have to look after certain other familial responsibilities. Some have stayed back through choice like we did. For us, it also gives us a kind of world view where the world is the political reality of New Delhi, where everything is fled to, right? This used to be a kind of place for printers and publishers, but it's kind of changed, except for the Bengali publishers. So it just gives you a different perspective, as I'm sure it does them when they look at us, But to say that you would not have thrived elsewhere, I don't know.
I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering. Yeah.
Other people do. So I just feel that if a bunch of us were shoved into Berlin, we would be as wonderful as we are here. Delhi's another story. Who knows?